COVID has brought us all together in a different perspective to help families out there. So I'm welcoming you. We've got a few people that have started to join us now.
Great.
So I'll stop rabbiting on. I know that we're tired, but it's a great opportunity to have you on here this morning. And I'm sure that you're going to be there to help lots and lots of other people. And I know this will be not the last. We are going to be doing some meetings where you can actually have some discussions with Isabelle. But I felt it's so important that we just get this webinar on, just to help families who are struggling over COVID as well. So welcome, Isabelle.
Thank you, Venessa. I wondered, I can't really see who's here, and I don't think we can have a chat, can we? So I think I'm just talking straight to people, and perhaps if they have questions, they might put it in the chat function, and we can deal with it at the end, maybe.
I mean, if you look, can you see on your attendees? Because you can see your attendees. There's two people that you do know there.
I'm looking now. Gosh, this is all new to me. Oh yes, hello, Leela and Hannah and Tanya.
So what you do, if they want to talk to you, if you go to their name, it says allow to talk. So they were able. If they do want to say something or they do want to talk, we can let them talk later on. But if they do have something, you can say put their hand up and put it on the chat. And if they want to talk, if you want it to be interactive, we can allow them to talk to you. So it's not that it's not, they're not there. They are there. It's just that we want to make sure your voice is being heard.
Just a little bit of it here. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Venessa. So I think the best thing is if people have questions, they put it in the chat function, and then at the end, if there's time, because I know we've only got an hour. So if there's time, we can answer the questions, and if not, I'll answer them by email or something. Okay, morning everybody. I am a Lambeth resident. I'm a mum to two extraordinary young people with autism, and I'm going to be talking with you today about inappropriate inpatient admission of autistic young people and children, and how to avoid it. Next slide, please. Thanks, Venessa. So I was going to do an interactive thing and say, who are you? What are you hoping to get from this talk? But given the time constraints, I think I'm just going to share what I've got to say and hope it's helpful. Next slide. So who am I? Obviously Isabelle Garnett. I've got a background in mainstream and autism education. I've been campaigning for homes not hospitals for many years now, and I'll explain a little bit more about what that means later. I'm an expert by experience for NHS England on their Learning Disability and Autism task force, and I support other families as of young people like mine as much as I can. And most importantly, I am a mum to two very amazing young people, one of whom you can see here. I can't move on the slides. Thank you. So this is what we'll be talking about over the next hour. What happened to Matthew? That's my eldest. What are the particular challenges autistic children and young people face? I mean, obviously this will be a very kind of a broad brush thing, because you could talk for weeks about that. But anyway, what can people do about mitigating those challenges and risks, and how I can recognise what if your child is at risk, and the key things that you need to know if that ever happens. God forbid it should, but let's hope that it's good to have that knowledge in case you should ever need it. And finally, where you can go to get more help and advice. So I was going to say, have you got any questions? But I think we'll just press over that slide. If you have questions, just put them in the chat function, and we'll look at them at the end. So this is the most important thing that we parents know, but services don't seem to know so much, and that really has to change. So Barry Prison is an authority on autism. He's done a lot of research and written a lot about it. And basically, autism isn't an illness; it's a different way of being. And what I am going to explain to you now is what happens when people think of autism as an illness rather than just a different way of being. So this is my boy when he was in one of the inpatient units, and he reached a crisis point that was predictable and preventable. He around about the age of 15, he, like, you know, puberty and different challenges, it meant that his needs, which had always, you know, he'd always had severe autism, always had the, you know, displayed behavior that challenges, but his needs obviously spiraled, and so did his behavior, and it changed. There was a lot of unpredictable behavior, and so the psychologist who was working with Matthew suggested that he might be having psychotic episodes, and we were a bit concerned, obviously, and we asked for help from CAMHS, and unfortunately what happened was very little, and we, to cut a very long story short, it was, if it gets too bad, call 999. And unfortunately it did get very difficult. Matthew became very distressed, and he was the police came, and he was taken to A&E, and at A&E he was sectioned and under section 3 for assessment and treatment, and what should have been assessment and treatment actually just became a downward spiral. It was more containment rather than assessment and treatment. And we discovered he wasn't psychotic at all, and actually he was just very distressed, very, very anxious. So we became very concerned about Matthew, because the catastrophic consequences of him being sent to an inpatient unit meant that he deteriorated. But basically it was an assessment and treatment. It was seclusion and forcible medication and prone restraint and awful other things like that, which you may or may not have seen happens to too many people in these inpatient units. And the bottom line is he didn't get better, he got a whole lot worse. So there was a case review of Matthew's case in the run-up to him being sectioned, and the findings were that it was a predictable and preventable sectioning crisis point, and that it was caused by a failure in joint working between health, education and social care. So it really wasn't about his mental health at all. It was about unmet need, and this is why I learned that autistic people need homes, not hospitals, and I discovered that actually that is something that the Mental Health Code of Practice actually says, that treatment in a familiar setting is usually more helpful, and that forced treatment in a hospital is usually not helpful. If you want to follow that up, that's chapter 20, section 20 of the Mental Health Code of Practice. Anyway, I'm wittering on, so I'm going to move on to the next slide because that's a horrible photo in it. And and it was a terrible, terrible time. I just thought I'd mention this report that was just last year. You may have seen on the news and on broadcast media the scandals of Walton Hall last year and Winterbourne View 10 years ago. And unfortunately, it does, whilst I am told that there are pockets of good practice, and I hope they are, my experience and the experience of many families that I know and work alongside is that this is a human rights issue, and often in these inpatient units, people's human rights are abused, and this is the report that was published by the Joint Committee on Human Rights, who are very concerned about this too. And I mentioned the documentary Under Lock and Key because that was a documentary that happened in between the Walton Hall BBC Panorama documentary and the Winterbourne View panorama. It's just to show that it's an ongoing thing, and things haven't changed enough over the last decade. Hopefully we'll see more change in the next coming years. Next slide, please, Venessa. So I just wanted to move on from that sad tragic picture of Matthew and what he felt when he was in an inpatient unit, and show you that actually, you know, Matthew wasn't ill. Yes, he had anxiety, like many young people with autism, and many people with autism live with anxiety on a daily basis. But that's part of the experience of living in a world that's not built for people with autism in many ways, you know, not just the sensory environment, but also the social environment. So, you know, that wasn't something that needed to be pathologized. It wasn't an illness like Barry Prisant says. It's just a different way of being. So Matthew, as you can see now, has the right support in the community, and you know, he doesn't need a whole multidisciplinary team. He does sometimes, but not on a daily basis. It's not rocket science what he needs. For Matthew, it's very simple. And again, it's not one size fits all, because everybody with autism is an individual and they may need different needs. So I thought I'd tell you what it looks like for Matthew. Basically, the right support that keeps him safe and happy and learning in the community is a very structured day, lots of visual support, a low arousal environment, a care team that are trained in autism and who know and understand him and are person-centered in their approach, removing as much as possible any anxiety, helping him to cope with the anxiety so that he knows exactly what's happening now and next, and that he's got a day that's filled with really meaningful activities and motivating activities, and teaching him the skills that he needs to be able to live a safe and happy life in the way that he needs to learn them. So it's active learning, it's doing what he needs to do, it's learning life skills rather than academic skills in isolation. He's kind of learning about time and temperature and things like that in the way, you know, in the real world, if you see what I mean. And it works. You know, basically in the ATU, in the acute treatment unit, he was routinely secluded. He was routinely restrained, prone restrained, which means face down, which is actually very frowned upon, particularly for children, because of the risk it poses to someone's life. And he was forcibly injected with high-dose antipsychotics in the inpatient unit. But from the minute he left the unit, he was no longer restrained and no longer secluded, no longer contained, no longer forcibly medicated. And he doesn't take any antipsychotic medication at all because he's not psychotic. He is autistic and his needs weren't being met. So he was distressed, and that behavior was a communication of unmet need. So it's not to say that he's not still challenged by his needs and his autism and the other conditions that he was only just recently diagnosed with, although they've been present all his life. Now those needs are understood and now those needs are met. He is able to live a fulfilling, safe and happy life. And it's not just the right thing to do, it's actually cheaper than it cost for him to be in an acute treatment unit. Some of these places charge an eye-watering amount of money for care which is at best neglect and abuse, certainly in Matthew's case. Anyway, moving on, he's smiling, he's safe and happy now, and that's the main thing. And the reason why I'm talking to you today is to make sure that every young person has the right to have their needs met and a right to be safe, happy and learning in the community. So let's move on. Thanks, Venessa. Next slide, please. So I thought it might be helpful to think about the particular challenges that autistic young people may face. This isn't everything, it's just the things that I've discovered through my work with NHS England and with other families, about, I don't know, 50 plus families I've worked alongside and I've been in contact with who've been through similar experiences to mine. These are just my reflections on the challenges that are poorly understood, I think, by the professionals, and just to be aware of them. Next slide, please, Venessa. So, issues around diagnosis. This is a quote from Ofsted's report back in 2018, and I think I know there are a lot of parents listening now, and yes, I mean, in our own borough, that at one point the waiting list for diagnosis was 3 years. That's improved now, but it's still too long. So it's kind of a late diagnosis, long waiting list, but it's also the issue of misdiagnosis. So with Matthew, for example, it was thought he might be psychotic. Well, no, but you hear about, you know, I've met families, I've spoken with families whose particularly daughters are diagnosed with personality disorder before they actually get their what is an autism diagnosis, and that often doesn't happen until they reach crisis point. So misdiagnosis, because the people diagnosing, the professionals may lack the training they need to be able to understand and support autism appropriately, and may therefore just put it down to something else that they don't understand. And I discovered that there's no neurodisability faculty in psychiatry. I am aware that there is a learning disability one, but autism and learning disability can co-occur, but they're not the same. They can't be conflated. So I think there is, certainly in my experience and in the experience of many other families, many psychiatrists do not have the training that they need in autism to be able to support, diagnose and appropriately treat people with autism. And that was certainly our family's experience. I don't want to get too bogged down in the detail, but yes, so having clinicians that understand autism is so important. Another issue that's really important that impacted on Matthew, but many other families, is kind of diagnostic overshadowing. And by that, what I mean is that everything's put down to the autism. So, the person doesn't get the help they need because everything's attributed to autism. And sometimes autism can be an exclusion criteria for getting that help. So I know in some areas, autism is a reason not to get speech and language therapy, whereas it is actually a lifetime social communication difficulty. So I know I've worked with young people when I was a practitioner, an SEN practitioner, where we were seeing young people being discharged from services because they had autism, but actually we had to fight for them to continue even when it was on their EHCP. So those are 3 issues which can really impact on a young person's development in their life. Next slide, please, Venessa. Thank you. And anxiety I wanted to mention because I think it's hugely underestimated by services, but I could give a whole talk about anxiety, but I just did this model here of the 4 areas of difference in autism because I thought it would be helpful to see why people with autism, in the vast majority, if in autistic people, experience anxiety, and it's basically these are 4 areas that affect people with autism from autistic people to a greater or lesser extent. Everybody's own individual profile of strengths and needs, and it explains why we have spiky profiles in autism. You can be hugely affected by your sensory processing, but be really brilliant at understanding and using language. It doesn't mean to say that your functioning and your ability to feel safe and comfortable in the world isn't severely impacted. So I hope that that's helpful. So it shows you it's when you're dealing with those all those separate differences, it's very difficult to you can understand why it is difficult to feel why you might and why anxiety is such a hugely important issue. And for my son and for many young people with autism, that is what underpinned all his behavior that was considered challenging. And often we think of challenging behavior only in terms of lashing out, but actually that unmet need, that anxiety is actually results in quite natural human reactions to fear and anxiety. So it's not just fight, it can be flight and it can be freeze, and that fighting can not just be lashing out at others, but it can be lashing out at yourself. And I think that's often misunderstood in by services, and anxiety can often be completely underestimated. So I wanted to flag that up, that always think about anxiety and minimizing anxiety, as this can be often the root cause of the distress that is experienced by your young person. Can we move on, please, Venessa? Thank you. This is also a very a misunderstood, often by services, where often it's girls, but it's not just girls, but where rather than lashing out at others because of distress or anxiety, the young person camouflages what they're feeling, and sometimes it can result in being the model student at school and then going home and melting down because of the stress of keeping it up all day. And yeah, it is. It means that often needs can be overlooked by services, but the difficulties that young person experiences do have a considerable, or can have a considerable emotional, mental and physical impact. And so services should really not underestimate the impact of that. And it's really important for them to listen to families and to believe families when they say what is happening for that young person at home. So I just wanted you to be aware of that too. Many of you I know will already be, but anyway, it is an issue that is underestimated. Moving on to the next slide. This is also a reality. CAMHS, I'm sure everyone knows, is overstretched. There was a documentary in 2018, I don't know whether you saw it, but it really impacted on me. And this really needs to change. There is a paucity of autism-specific services. I mean, I just mean they just don't really exist. And in many areas, as I mentioned before, autism can sometimes be an exclusion criteria for some of those services. However, the great news is that NHS England has recognised this, and for the first time in their long-term plan, have made children and young people and autism specifically a priority. This is just hopefully going to result in more autism-specific services and better provision in CAMHS for our young people. Moving on. Oh, thanks. Yeah, that was just the point about that I was making about the need for people to have in CAMHS to have the right training so that they understand autism and don't, what I call, pathologize it. You know, don't think of it as an illness, but actually understand the differences and the needs that need to be met in a different way. Next slide, please. Another issue that is not poorly understood is medication. And I have been working with other families and people with lived experience with NHS England on the STOMP and STAMP campaign, and that mouthful stands for Stopping the Over-Medication of Children and Young People with a Learning Disability, Autism or Both. And STAMP stands for Supporting Treatment and Appropriate Medication in Paediatrics. And basically what it means is that people with autism, autistic people and people with learning disabilities should only have the right medication at the right time for the right reasons, and only that, and not be medicated for something that they don't need. It should never, ever be, medication should never be a replacement for the support somebody with autism needs. So as an example, for my son, he was over medicated with antipsychotic medication, not because he needed it, but because that was a form of chemical restraint. It made him, you know, well, basically it was a chemical cosh that meant that, you know, he could be warehoused in an acute treatment unit, and it didn't really meet his needs. And in fact, what now meets his needs is very simple. It needs the right support, and he's got it now, thankfully. But medication should never be a replacement for that right support. And families don't really may not be aware of this. Certainly, many doctors, particularly in well, I don't know, in my experience, particularly in paediatrics, aren't necessarily aware. There needs to be a bit of a culture change, I think. And I I feel very strongly about psychotropic medication and antipsychotics in particular, because there's been no research on children, let alone children who have a neurodisability. And I just feel very strongly that that medication should only be given as a very last resort and not as a first line of response. And that's what Stomp and Stamp are all about. In my work with NHS England, I've heard families saying that schools have placed pressure on them to go to CAMHS to get medication for their child so they can still access that so to prevent their exclusion, essentially. And that is very wrong, because it's no substitute for the right support. Yeah, just to be aware of that. Now, this information can be found on the NHS England website, and I'll make sure that I post I send the links to this to Venessa so she can share it. Okay, Venessa, next slide, please. Thank you. So this is the stuff that I really want to share with you, and God forbid that it should ever happen to anyone else's child, but just important information to bear in mind, just in case. Moving on. So we did touch on the particular challenges young people with autism might face, and I know this is quite a scary quote from Mark Lever, but I just felt it was important to say, because it's actually real, and if we know about what the risks are, we can do something to make sure that it doesn't happen to our loved ones. So we know that there's worse physical and mental health outcomes for people with autism and autistic, learning, I'll start again, semantics, autistic people and people with learning disabilities. And partly that's to do with, a lack of waiting lists for diagnosis, waiting for support, unmet need, services being stretched. So, there is those factors can result in autistic people and their families really struggling. And as I mentioned, the NHS England have recognised that with their long-term plan. So, that's good. But in the meantime, we are going to be waiting for things to change. And so it's good to be aware, I think. Forewarned is forearmed is what I think I've learned to know is helpful. And I think particularly women and girls are neglected, as it were, just misunderstood, overlooked often, because the female presentation, for want of a better way of expressing it, can be very different to the male diagnostic criteria that we've got. And this means that they are often diagnosed late, and they may go undiagnosed. I know through my work with NHS England that a large number of young women with autism actually don't get diagnosed until they're in crisis, until they're in inpatient units often, and that needs to change. And training up services to recognise autism is part of that. So the statistic, it might be a little bit old now, but I suspect it had, because I got that statistic about a year ago, but I hope it's changed. But at that time, 61% of young people under 18 living in inpatient units were actually female. So it is a real issue that needs addressing. Next slide, please, Venessa. So how can you recognise the signs that your child or your loved one might be at risk. And these are the some of the things that might show that your child it could be at risk of crisis. Firstly, the young person and the family being isolated, unmet need and a lack of support for that, and also a lack of respite to enable families to support their child. Moving on to education, a huge sign is school refusal. And often this can be, well, anyway, I can talk for England on this. Exclusion is another sign, another flag, and off-rolling. And off-rolling means when someone is basically sent, allowed to remain on the school's register, but actually is actually not actually admitted into the school physically. And then OAA means out of area placement. That can be a sign that that young person may be at risk of crisis. And then if we look at health, mental health illness, maybe development of eating disorders or something else, anxiety escalating, distress behaviour, so that could be lashing out at others, lashing out at themselves, lack of CAM support is a huge factor, can be a huge factor. And then I've put medication plus. What I mean is so increased medication or multiple medication, because sometimes what we see is that young people get given a drug and then they get given another drug because that drug isn't working, and then they get given another drug, and they can often end up on a kind of cocktail of drugs. And as I mentioned before, medication shouldn't be a replacement for the right support, so that can be a sign that that young person has unmet need and is at risk of crisis. Moving on to the next slide. So I think I quoted this before, but this is just the thing that in the Mental Health Act Code of Practice that recognises that actually people with autism in the vast majority of cases need homes, not hospitals. They will their needs, if their needs can at all be met in the community, that they are much likely to have a better outcome. And that's supported by law. Moving on. So I thought it'd be helpful here to kind of say what the Learning Disability and Autism Programme, part of the 10-year plan, is going to be focusing on, because NHS England has recognised all those issues. And so over the next 10 years, they're going to be looking at improving community support so that autistic people and people with learning disabilities can lead fulfilling lives in the community, in homes and not hospitals, which is fantastic news. They're going to be strengthening the focus that there needs to be on the needs of autistic people, particularly children and young people, because early intervention can prevent more bigger issues developing later in life that are easier, that are harder to solve at that point in time. They're pledging to make sure that any services that are commissioned by NHS England are going to be providing good quality care and treatment for our loved ones. And they're also focusing on reducing health inequalities. So annual health checks are being rolled out for everybody who has a learning disability at the moment. And there are pilot projects to roll that out for autistic people as well, to address that issue of those health inequalities that we talked about earlier, and prevent and reducing the over medication of people, autistic people, through Stomp Stamp, as I mentioned earlier, and preventing avoidable deaths. And that's the LEADER program, reviewing, and that's basically reviewing the deaths of people who have learning disabilities, some of whom will also have co-occurring autism. If you want to find out more about these priorities, I've included the link there so that you can find out more. But I am really excited about this work, and I hope it will bring about huge, much needed change. Moving on. So this is the start of the kind of take-home message. I didn't know about dynamic support registers, and this, I think, is one of the reasons why my son was sectioned. In every area, there is a dynamic support register. It can be called many different things. It can be a dynamic risk register. It can be I don't know, there are lots of different names, but essentially they're all the same thing. It is keeping an eye on those young people who may be at risk of crisis and may be at risk of being admitted to an inpatient unit, so that they can receive the right support to prevent their admission if they don't need to be admitted. It also means that those young people have the chance of having a care, education and treatment review. Now, this is a very different meeting to any of the sort of standard EHCP meetings that you may have, or Team Around the Child. This is a very specific type of review, and I will talk a little bit more about it in a minute. So if you think that your child is at risk of an inpatient admission, it's really important for them to be on this dynamic risk register. And the way to find out whether your child is, or to kind of inquire whether your child needs to be, is to speak to whoever your lead medical professional is. So it could be a paediatrician, or it could be the CANS person, or anyone really that is working closely with your child. So it could be the social worker, and every person should know about that. Unfortunately, my son wasn't on the dynamic risk register, despite having severe autism and learning disabilities. He wasn't. So it's important, and I think the big risk is that autistic people who do not have a learning disability, or one that is identified, are often not already known to services, and so may not necessarily be put on the dynamic support register when they actually need to be. So it's really important for families to know that this exists, and that actually it is a very positive thing. It's not a scary thing at all. It's actually a lifeline, and that you may, if you aren't known to services, if your child isn't known to services, that actually you can ask for them to be put on it. And if you don't get any joy with any of the professionals working with your child, and if they don't know about it, you can find out who your senior responsible officer is in your area. And the way to do that is to go on that, is to click on that link. You can find it on the NHS website. It should list per area who is your senior responsible officer, and you can contact them. Next. So this is care, education and treatment reviews. So these are special reviews that are conducted, that are run by people who are independent. It will also include the commissioner for your area, so that person's not necessarily independent, but it also, the review panel has a clinical expert by experience who is independent, and also an expert by experience. So somebody who either has been in an inpatient unit themselves, or maybe their family member who has experience of that, lived experience of using those services. And that's really important because it gives an objective view on what support your young person might need if they're at risk of crisis, to prevent an admission, but also to help the young person, if they are already in the inpatient unit, to be discharged to the right support in the community. So you can find out more about CETRs there, and I'll share some other resources that are useful. But basically, this is a very good thing. Unfortunately, my son didn't have a CTR until 6 months after he was in an inpatient unit. But I have no doubt that if he'd had a CTR before admission, an inappropriate admission to hospital would have been prevented. So it is a very good thing. And the important thing is that anyone can ask for it. That could be you, it could be your young person themselves, could be an advocate, could be your clinical lead, it could be anyone from the local authority working with your child. Anyone can ask, including you. So do remember about care and treatment reviews if you think your child is at risk. Thanks, Venessa.